The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring. Harold Mercer almost threw it away. He almost didn't open it. And for the rest of his life, through every sleepless night, every courtroom hearing, every farewell glance at the land his father had broken his back to own, he would wish he hadn't. The Mercer farm sat on 240 acres of rolling Wisconsin land, and in 1976, it was debt-free. Every single acre. Harold's father, Earl Mercer, had paid off the last note in April of that year, and the family had celebrated with a quiet dinner, pot roast, apple pie, and a single bottle of beer that Earl nursed for 3 hours because he was not a drinking man. But tonight was different. Tonight, the land was truly theirs. No bank owns a single blade of grass on this property, Earl had said, pressing his palm flat on the kitchen table like he was swearing an oath. Remember that, Harold. Remember what that feels like. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Harold was 26 years old. He remembered. They ran 36 milking cows, a modest operation by any measure, but a clean one. Harold knew each animal by name. He knew which ones were stubborn in the morning, which ones would let you lean your head against their warm flank when the February cold cut through the barn like a knife. The farm produced enough. It paid for groceries, school clothes, the occasional repair. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. And then the letter came. The return address read, First Agricultural Bank of Wisconsin. Inside was a single page, neatly typed, with Harold's name printed at the top. It had always belonged there. Dear Mr. Mercer, based on your property assessment and current agricultural projections, First Agricultural Bank is pleased to offer you a line of credit up to $400,000 at a fixed rate of 7.5% over 20 years. We believe the time to grow is now. Harold set the letter on the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he walked to the barn, stood in the middle of it, and looked at his 36 cows. He did the math the way farmers do, not on paper, but in his gut. 36 cows. One man, one wife, one teenage son. What if it were 175? He didn't call the bank that day. He waited a week. He talked to his wife, Linda, who listened carefully and said very little. He talked to his son, Donnie, who was 16 and lit up like a lantern at the idea of something bigger, something real. He even talked to Earl, who was 63 by then, and walking with a cane he pretended he didn't need. Banks don't give money because they like you, Earl said. They give money because they see a way to take something from you later. Times have changed, Dad. Earl had looked at him with those gray, flat eyes that never gave anything away. The land hasn't. Harold signed the papers 3 weeks later. The transformation of the Mercer farm happened fast. Faster than Harold expected. Faster, maybe, than was wise. They broke ground on the new milking parlor in June. It was a proper setup. A herringbone parlor that could handle 20 cows at a bull. Time, stainless steel lines, vacuum pumps. The kind of equipment Harold had only seen in agricultural magazines. He walked through it the day it was finished and felt something he had never felt before on this land. He felt important. New silos went up in August. 2 of them, towering concrete cylinders that you could see from the county road a mile away. People slowed their trucks as they drove past. Some stopped. A few came up the driveway just to look. Harold Mercer is going big, the feed store owner said one Saturday morning, and Harold had smiled and paid for his order and driven home feeling like a man who had finally figured something out. By October, the herd stood at 175 head. 175 cows, all registered Holsteins, each one worth real money on paper. Harold had taken on 2 hired hands, brothers from over in Dodge County named Ray and Curtis Plank, who knew cattle and worked without complaint. Linda had started keeping 2 sets of books because now there were 2 sets of everything. The first year, the milk checks were extraordinary. Harold framed the biggest one and hung it in the kitchen. It happened so quietly that Harold almost missed it. He was standing at the bulk tank one morning in January 1979 when he noticed the co-op check was smaller. Not dramatically smaller, just smaller. He assumed it was a seasonal fluctuation. The price of milk moved. Everyone knew that. The next check was smaller still. By spring, Harold sat down with Linda and spread the numbers across the kitchen table, the same table where Earl had pressed his hand and made his declaration, and they stared at what they saw without speaking for a long time. The milk price had dropped 18% from its peak. "It'll come back," Harold said. "How long can we carry it if it doesn't?" Linda asked. Harold didn't answer. He was already doing the math again. This time the numbers felt different in his gut. This time they sat heavy. He called the bank. The loan officer, a cheerful man named Gary Hofstede, who had shaken Harold's hand like an old friend the day the papers were signed, told him not to worry. "This is a temporary correction in the market, Harold. Every farmer in the state is feeling it. You're solid. Your asset base is strong." "What does that mean exactly?" Harold asked. "It means the land backs you up." Harold thanked him and hung up. He walked out to the barn and stood among his 175 cows and thought about what his father had said. The land hasn't changed. But the numbers had. What no one told Harold, what perhaps no one fully understood in 1976 when the banks were throwing money at every farmer who would take it, was that the entire agricultural economy had been built on assumptions that were about to shatter. In 1979, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to fight inflation. They raised them aggressively. The prime rate climbed past 15%, then 18%. Then, in the summer of 1981, it hit 21.5%, the highest it had ever been in American history. Harold's loan wasn't at 21.5%. His fixed rate held. But everything around him was. The equipment dealers who had financed their inventory, the co-ops that had borrowed to build storage, the farmland values that had been used as collateral everywhere, by everyone, all at once. And then land prices began to fall. Harold first heard about it from Ray Plank, who had a cousin over in Iowa. "Prices out there are dropping hard," Ray said one morning. "Guys who borrowed against land value, they're getting calls from the bank." "We're not in Iowa," Harold said. "Not yet," Ray said quietly, and went back to work. It was the "not yet" that kept Harold awake that night. And the night after. He lay in the dark next to Linda and listened to the old farmhouse settle around him and thought about the word his father had used that day in the kitchen. Theirs. Was it still theirs? Gary Hofstede called on a Wednesday in March 1982. Harold could tell from the first syllable that this was not the same Gary who had shaken his hand. That Gary had been warm, casual, a man selling optimism. This Gary was formal, careful. Careful, that meant lawyers had already been consulted. "Harold, I need to speak with you about the valuation on your property. We've had to conduct a reassessment." Harold's hand tightened on the phone. "And?" "The current assessed value has declined, combined with the payment arrears from the last 2 quarters. The bank has some concerns about the loan-to-value ratio on your account." "I'm 3 months behind," Harold said. "Milk prices. I understand the market challenges, Harold, but the bank has obligations too. We're going to need to discuss your options." "Options," Harold repeated. The word felt wrong in his mouth, like it meant something else. "We could discuss restructuring, or..." Gary paused. "Or we could talk about what a voluntary sale might look like, while you still have equity." Harold hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He walked outside. It was a cold March morning. The field still locked under a thin crust of ice that would be gone by afternoon. He stood at the fence line and looked at the land his father had paid off, the land that Earl had pressed his hand against, and he felt something shift in his chest, a slow and terrible movement, like the earth itself giving way. He did not tell Linda about the call for 3 days. Harold Mercer was not a man who surrendered. He did not sit down. He did not quit. He sold the newer tractor first. The big John Deere he had bought in 1977 and loved the way a man loves a fine tool, and used the money to catch up on payments. He renegotiated the schedule on the parlor equipment. He let Ray Plank go, kept Curtis on half hours. Linda took a job at the school, cafeteria work, starting at 6 in the morning. She never complained. She never once said, "I told you so," even though Harold could sometimes see the sentence living behind her eyes. Donnie, who was 22 now, and had come back after 2 years at the agriculture college, worked beside his father without being asked. There were mornings when Harold watched his son move through the barn, efficient, serious, jaw set against the cold, and felt a grief so sharp it was almost physical. This was not the future he had been building toward. This was something else. They made it through 1983 by the thinnest of margins. The herd was down to 140 head, then 110. They were selling off cattle to pay for feed, to feed the remaining cattle, a math that could only go one direction. And Harold Mercer, a man who had built everything with his hands and his nerve, knew exactly where it was going. Harold knew it, Linda knew it, even the cows seemed to know it. They were restless in October, lowing in the dark at nothing, pacing the stalls with a low, nervous energy that Harold had never seen in 30 years around animals. He stood in the barn at 2 in the morning with a lantern and talked to them, the way he had when they were only 36. He called them by name: Bessie, Clara, old Ruth, who had been with him since the beginning. He apologized to them, which was a thing he had never done before and would never tell anyone. A grown man in a cold barn, apologizing to cows. But they had trusted him too, and he had let them down the same way the bank had let him down, without warning, without shame, with the calm face of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for you to catch up. Donnie came in around 3 that morning and found his father still there, lantern in hand, standing in silence. The boy, he was 22, but Harold still thought of him as the boy, said nothing. He just walked to the far end of the barn and started the morning work 4 hours early. Harold watched him for a long moment. Then he turned off the lantern and did the same. The bankruptcy papers were filed in February 1984. It was not dramatic. There was no single terrible morning, no sheriff at the door, no auction crowd standing in the yard while strangers bid on everything you had built. Harold had half expected it to be loud, some final rupture, a scene worthy of what was being lost. Instead, it happened in an office in Madison, across a table from 2 bank representatives in pressed suits and a lawyer who kept refilling his coffee cup, and it was very quiet and very orderly, which somehow made it worse. No one raised their voice. No one even looked uncomfortable. These were men doing a job they had done many times before, with other Harolds on other Tuesdays, and they would do it many times again. Harold signed where they told him to sign. He did not count the pages. Linda sat beside him with her hands, folded in her lap, straight back the way she always sat in public, giving nothing away to strangers. She did not cry until they were in the truck. Then she cried for a long time, not loudly, not with her face in her hands, but in that steady, silent way that is somehow harder to watch than any other kind of grief. Harold drove and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The fields passed on both sides of the county road, bare and grey under the February sky, and he did not look at them. They kept the house. The terms of the restructuring allowed for that much. The house and the equipment shed and a half-acre of yard that suddenly felt like a cage. The land, 240 acres, the same 240 acres Earl Mercer had pressed his palm against and declared free and clear, transferred to the bank. They would sell it within the year, to a corporate operation out of Illinois that Harold never met and never wanted to. That company would consolidate the Mercer land with 3 other failed farms in the county and run 800 head where Harold had run 36. The new silos stayed. The herringbone parlor stayed. Everything Harold had built stayed and wore a different name and produced for someone else. Earl died that April. Harold had not told his father the full extent of what had happened. Not the bankruptcy filing, not the transfer of the land, but he always believed Earl knew. Earl had stopped asking about the farm in January, stopped making the slow walk out to look at the fields in the morning, which had been his habit for 40 years. He had simply withdrawn, quietly and without explanation, as if he was removing himself from something he could not bear to watch, and would not insult by pretending otherwise. At the funeral, Harold stood at the graveside in the same suit he had worn to the bank in Madison, and he thought about a kitchen table and a hand pressed flat against it and a voice that said, "No. Bank owns a single blade of grass on this property." He thought about how certain his father had been, how absolute. He thought about how he had stood in this same yard 20 years ago, 26 years old and full of his own certainty, and told his father that times had changed. He could not look at the coffin for very long. He focused instead on a point, somewhere past it, a stand of bare oaks along the property line, the very edge of what had once been theirs. And he stayed there until the pastor finished and the people began to move. What happened to us happened to thousands of farm families across the Midwest in those years, Harold would say later in 1998 when a documentary filmmaker found him and asked him to talk about it. He was 52 by then, silver at the temples, a man who had rebuilt a smaller life with careful hands, a job at the county co-op, a garden, a house that was paid for and would stay paid for because he had learned the price of debt in a way that could not be unlearned. He sat in a folding chair in his backyard and spoke without bitterness, which the filmmaker found remarkable and Harold found simply necessary. The banks came to us. They sought us out. They told us the future was in growth, that land would always go up, that we could not lose. And we believed them because we wanted to believe them, because we had worked hard and we thought we deserved something bigger. He paused and looked off past the camera for a moment. My father told me the day I signed, "You can borrow your way onto land, but you cannot borrow your way into owning it." I thought he was just old. I thought he didn't understand how the world worked anymore. Another pause, longer, slower. He understood everything. He had just already lived through one version of this story, and he knew how it ended. I didn't listen, that's on me. But the bank knew too, and they came to my door anyway. Between 1980 and 1988, over 300,000 American farm families lost their land. The farm crisis was the largest collapse of rural America since the Dust Bowl. It was not a natural disaster. It was a financial one, engineered in its way by the same institutions that had spent the 1970s knocking on farmhouse doors with briefcases full of easy money, and then spent the 1980s knocking again with lawyers. Harold Mercer was one of 300,000. He was not reckless. He was not foolish. He was a man who believed what he was told by people who wore suits and spoke in the language of confidence and growth and opportunity. The same language that has been used to separate working people from what they own since long before Harold Mercer was born and long after.